The aftermath of World War I, seeds of a greater disaster. In 1918, World War I came to an end. Europe was left in ruins, its cities shattered and its people broken. Over 16 million lives had been lost in a war that no one could truly claim victory in. But in the silence that followed, as the world tried to heal, seeds were sown for an even greater disaster. In June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed at the Palace of Versailles in France. The treaty placed the blame for the war squarely on Germany, holding the country responsible for the entire conflict. The terms were harsh, punitive, and marked the beginning of a long period of humiliation for the German people. For Germany, it was not just a military defeat. It was a national humiliation. They were forced to pay staggering war reparations, amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars in today's currency. The country lost all its colonies, and key parts of its territory were taken away, including areas that had been German for centuries. More devastatingly, Germany was forbidden from building a military, placed under strict surveillance, and forced to accept terms that would later be known as surrender without a shot being fired. But the victors, particularly Britain and France, paid little attention to the consequences of such harsh terms. Instead, their focus was on punishing the defeated. Alongside Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. The Ottoman Empire, once a mighty symbol of Islamic power, was carved up into spheres of influence controlled by Britain and France. The Middle East became a new geopolitical battleground, and the old order of empires fell apart, leaving a vacuum that would soon breed conflict. Back in Germany, the situation was dire. The country teetered on the brink of collapse. The economy quickly spiraled out of control. People could hold their money in their hands, but it was useless for buying even the most basic necessities like bread. Inflation soared to the point that, by 1923, 1 mark in 1914 was worth over 1,000 billion marks. Money became worthless, and society fell into chaos and despair. Photographs from this time show women carrying baskets full of paper currency, and children playing with piles of banknotes, stacking them as if they were toys. Banks printed money around the clock, but it was still not enough to meet basic needs. Amidst this despair, the German people began to lose faith in their new democratic government, the Weimar Republic. And it was in this fertile ground of frustration and instability that extremist voices began to rise. At the same time, in Italy, the Treaty of Versailles had left the victorious nation with little to show for its efforts. The people were disillusioned. The economy was in ruins. Politics was chaotic. In 1922, a man with a powerful voice, a strong presence, and a vision for dictatorial rule, Benito Mussolini, rose to power. Mussolini promised to restore Italy to its imperial glory, much like ancient Rome, and this vision gave birth to fascism in Europe, not in Berlin, but in Rome. But the true global crisis began in 1929, when the US stock market crashed, sending shockwaves around the world. The Great Depression of the 20th century spread across the globe, and Germany, already weakened by war debts and political instability, was brought to the brink of total collapse. Unemployment soared, and millions of people had nothing left to lose. It was in this moment of despair that a small, extremist party, once ignored, suddenly became a beacon of hope for the desperate. This was the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, a former soldier, who had been nearly blinded by gas on the Western Front. Hitler's promise to restore Germany's honor resonated with millions of Germans. 3. The Pacific Front, an unquenchable fire. From 1942 onward, the United States began to fight back in the Pacific. The battlefield here was very different from Europe. It was island warfare, where every inch of land had to be blooded to reclaim. Key battles included Midway, 1942, the first turning point, where the US sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, stepping stones towards Japan, but at great cost. Every meter of land was a graveyard. The Japanese fought to the last man. They saw surrender as dishonorable. Some even resorted to kamikaze suicide pilots crashing their planes into U.S. warships. The Pacific War became an endless, blood-soaked nightmare. But this front wasn't just about the military. In the regions occupied by Japan, China, Indochina, Southeast Asia, war crimes were rampant. Over 10 million Chinese died in the war. Hundreds of thousands of women were forced into sexual slavery. Forced migrations, conscription, and genocide of native populations. Biological experiments on living humans, most famously by Unit 731 in Manchuria. The war in Asia was not just about conquest, it was a series of crimes against humanity. 4. 3 fronts, one fate. By 1942, the world was divided into 3 major theaters. The Eastern Front, where Germany and the Soviet Union clashed in brutal battles. The Pacific Front, where the US faced off with Japan on the seas and islands. The Western Front and North Africa, where British, American, and resistance forces were preparing to strike back. The war was no longer about nations, it had become a life-or-death struggle for humanity. Blood was spilling across 3 continents. Darkness covered the sky. But amid the smoke and flames, an alliance was forming. The most devastated, the most wounded, the most desperate nations, they refused to surrender. And from 1943 onward, the wheels of history began to turn. Part 5. The Turning Point, the Eastern Front and the Allied Counteroffensive, Stalingrad, El Alamein, Italy surrender, counterattacks from North Africa. By 1942, the nightmare that was World War II showed no signs of stopping. But amidst the deepest darkness, there began to emerge a glimmer of light. Seemingly hopeless battles, cities that had once been symbols of suffering, now became turning points in human history. Stalingrad, the city that would not bow, perhaps no city on earth has shed more blood and tears than Stalingrad. Located along the Volga River, the city not only bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, but also served as a crucial gateway to the oil-rich Caucasus region, a vital target for Hitler. In the summer of 1942, the German army launched a new offensive, Fall Blau, aimed directly at the southern part of Russia. Stalingrad stood in its path. Initially, the Germans didn't plan to capture the city. But Hitler, obsessed with the name Stalingrad, insisted on taking it as a symbolic victory. Stalin, on the other hand, couldn't afford to lose a city bearing his name. He issued the order, no retreat. Anyone who retreats will be shot. Thus began the Battle of Stalingrad, the most brutal urban warfare in modern history. Every building became a fortress. Every basement became a front line. Every floor was fought over, with Germans holding it by day, Soviets reclaiming it by night. Part 3. Europe in the Darkness. Paris, June 1940. German tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées. The swastika flag fluttered on the Eiffel Tower. No gunshots, no clashes, the City of Light surrendered almost without condition. France, the pride of Europe, had fallen in just 6 weeks. After France's swift defeat, Europe entered its darkest period of the 20th century. Almost the entire continent lay beneath the boot of Nazi Germany. Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, France completely occupied. Czechoslovakia, Austria already annexed. Poland divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria under Germany's influence. Italy, Hitler's close ally, led by Mussolini. All became part of a Europe under Berlin's command. In France, Hitler set up a puppet government in the south known as the Vichy government, under the leadership of Marshal Pétain. They claimed to be neutral, but effectively obeyed Germany's orders, collaborating in oppressive policies and the hunt for Jews. The northern part of France, from Paris to the English Channel, was under direct German occupation, with German forces setting up headquarters, controlling streets, food, media, and silence. The French, once a proud people, now lived with their heads bowed, silent, submissive, or in rebellion. The European resistance movement didn't begin with gunfire. It started with leaflets passed hand to hand, coded messages, secret meetings in wine cellars, small yet dangerous actions, setting train schedules wrong, hiding documents, stealing food, even hanging French flags in front of German soldiers. Every occupied country had its own resistance force. France had the Resistance. Poland had Armia Krajowa, the underground national army. Yugoslavia had communist partisans, led by Tito. Greece, Norway, Belgium also had underground networks operating. In the shadows, another war began, guerrilla warfare between civilians and Nazi soldiers. Yet, a glimmer of light remained from across the English Channel. Britain, the only country not yet defeated, not yet invaded, and had no intention of doing so. After France's fall, Hitler turned his focus, conquer Britain. He planned a campaign named Operation Sea Lion, the first amphibious assault in modern military history. But to carry it out, Germany needed control of the skies. And thus, the Battle of Britain began. In July 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched intense bombing raids against the Royal Air Force, RAF, bases. The campaign was meticulously planned. Target radar stations, airfields, aircraft factories. The goal was to cripple Britain's air defense. But the British were not so easily defeated. They had a secret weapon, radar. This new technology allowed the RAF to detect German planes from afar and deploy fighters accurately and promptly. The world was stunned. Two ideological enemies, fascism and communism, shaking hands. But behind the diplomatic curtain was a secret agreement, a division of Europe. The western part of Poland would go to Germany. The eastern part would go to the Soviet Union. The Baltic states would be handed over to Stalin. Romania would also be split. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had officially paved the way for World War II. On the morning of September 1, 1939, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. In the skies, bombers rained down fire on Warsaw. They employed a completely new strategy, one never before seen in history, blitzkrieg lightning warfare. Gone were the days of trench warfare like in World War I. Blitzkrieg was a fast-paced total assault, with seamless coordination between air forces, tanks, and infantry. The enemy barely had time to react before being cut through. In just 5 days, Poland was in chaos. 16 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland was split, its army shattered. The people fled, tens of thousands were captured, tortured, or sent to forced labor. In response, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had officially begun. However, the strange part was, nothing happened on the Western Front. Even though they had declared war, Britain and France did not advance. They still believed Hitler only wanted to adjust borders, not initiate a full-scale war. For many months, between late 1939 and early 1940, the Western Front remained completely quiet. This period in history is known as the Phony War. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, an important railway line and seaport was still functioning, the route transporting iron ore from Sweden, through Norway, to Germany. Britain wanted to cut off this supply to choke off Germany's arms industry. So, Britain prepared to send troops to Norway. But Hitler reacted faster. In April 1940, Germany unexpectedly attacked Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered almost immediately. Norway put up more resistance, but eventually fell. Within a few days, Germany controlled all of Northern Europe. Less than a month later, Germany launched the largest campaign of the war so far, an attack on Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium. With blitzkrieg tactics, the German army struck at the weaknesses of the Maginot Line, a defensive system France had spent 10 years constructing. But the French were wrong. They thought Germany would fight, just like in World War I. Instead of attacking directly, the Germans bypassed the Ardennes forest, an area the Allies believed was impassable for tanks. The panzer divisions tore through the defenses, encircling the British and French armies from the rear. At the port of Dunkirk, over 300,000 Allied soldiers were trapped by the sea. But a miracle happened. Operation Dynamo. Thousands of civilian boats crossed the channel, under fire, to rescue them back to Britain. Still, it was a strategic defeat. Soon after, Paris fell. France surrendered. The northern and western parts were occupied by Germany. The rest of the country became the Vichy puppet government, under the covert control of Hitler. In just 10 months, Adolf Hitler had accomplished what no one thought possible. Annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. Crushed Poland. Took control of Northern Europe. Defeated the Netherlands, Belgium, and even France. And now, across the entire European continent, there was only one independent country left daring to stand up to Nazi Germany, the United Kingdom. In the next part, we'll dive into the most intense aerial battle in history, the Battle of Britain, and the unexpected twist when Hitler turned his back on his Soviet ally to open the Eastern Front. In September 1940, Hitler changed tactics. Instead of just targeting military sites, he ordered the bombing of major cities, especially London. The air raids lasted for months, known as the Blitz. Every night, air raid sirens blared, millions of citizens rushed into bomb shelters. Streets were set ablaze, houses were reduced to rubble, hospitals were destroyed. But the British spirit never wavered. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Winston Churchill emerged as an unyielding beacon of resolve. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender," he said. Those words weren't just a call to arms, they were an oath for an entire nation. By the end of October 1940, the Battle of Britain ended in defeat for Hitler. The RAF held its ground. The German Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses, nearly 1,700 aircraft shot down. Operation Sea Lion was cancelled. Hitler could not conquer Britain. For the first time since the war began, Germany had been stopped. But to the south, in the Balkans, another part of the world began to burn. In October 1940, Mussolini, Hitler's ally, decided to expand his influence by attacking Greece. He thought it would be an easy victory. But the Greeks fought back fiercely, pushing Italian forces out of the border with Albania. Mussolini was humiliated. Hitler could not let his ally be embarrassed, nor could he allow Britain to establish bases in the Balkans too close to the Romanian oil fields, which supplied Germany's fuel. And so, Hitler's Balkan campaign began. In April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. In just a few weeks, both countries collapsed. Germany occupied Athens, raising the flag on the Parthenon. However, in the Balkans, Hitler made a major strategic mistake. The campaign dragged on longer than expected, delaying his planned invasion of the Soviet Union, a turning point that would decide the fate of the entire war. By mid-1941, the map of Europe was almost entirely engulfed in Nazi grey. From the Atlantic coast to the gates of Asia. From freezing Norway to the Mediterranean islands. Only Britain and the Soviet Union, the two major powers, remained unconquered. But a monster was awakening in the east. A new battlefield fiercer than anything the world had ever seen was about to open. And this time, Hitler would break his pact with Stalin, launching the attack known as Operation Barbarossa, the largest war in human history. Part 4, Earthquake from the East. Japan and the US enter the war Barbarossa, when Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. Summer of 1941, Hitler and the Axis powers seemed to be at the peak of their power. Europe had been conquered, Britain was isolated, and the United States had yet to officially enter the war. But 3 seismic shocks would completely change the course of the conflict from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. German soldiers called it the meat grinder, 400s of thousands perished in just weeks. The Soviet Red Army, constantly reinforced via the Volga River, began to tighten the noose. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a perfect pincer move, trapping the entire Sixth Army of Germany in the city. Hitler refused to allow any retreat, and during the harsh winter, 300,000 German soldiers were surrounded, starving, freezing, and dying in the ruins. On February 2, 1943, General Friedrich Paulus surrendered, marking the first true defeat for Nazi Germany. Stalingrad became the first turning point, a blow to the prestige and morale of the Nazis, and a new hope for the world. El Alamein, Churchill and the glimmer of hope from North Africa at the same time. On the other side of the world, another crucial battle was unfolding in the deserts of North Africa. Germany and Italy, led by the famed General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, were closing in on the Suez Canal, the lifeline for the British Empire. Losing the Suez Canal would mean losing access to India, East Africa, and the Middle East. All that stood between Rommel's forces and the canal was the small town of El Alamein in Egypt. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, under immense political pressure in London, knew that if El Alamein fell, the British Empire could collapse. He sent General Bernard Montgomery to halt Rommel's advance. In October 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein began, one of the first successful counterattacks by the Allies. The British had superior artillery, air support, and logistics, and for the first time, Rommel was defeated. Churchill later said, "Before El Alamein, we never won a battle. After El Alamein, we never lost one." Midway, the US reclaims control in the Pacific, not only in Europe and North Africa, but also in the Pacific Ocean. Another turning point was taking place. In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan sought to wipe out the US Navy once again. Their target, Midway Island, a vital outpost in the Pacific. However, what they didn't anticipate was that the US had broken the Japanese naval code. The US Navy, under Admiral Chester Nimitz, set a perfect trap. The result: 4 Japanese aircraft carriers sunk. Nearly 300 planes lost. Thousands of Japanese sailors were killed. The US lost only 1 carrier. The Battle of Midway was the first decisive victory for the US at sea. From that moment, the balance of power in the Pacific began to shift. At the end of 1942, another major operation was launched. It was called Operation Torch, a combined British-American campaign. The goal was to liberate North Africa from the Axis and create a launchpad for an invasion of Europe through the Mediterranean. The Allies landed in Morocco and Algeria, gradually pushing the Germans back toward Tunisia. By May 1943, all of North Africa was liberated. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were captured, roughly the same number as those lost at Stalingrad. This victory paved the way for the next step, invading Italy, the southern stronghold of Nazi Germany. In July 1943, the Allies landed on the island of Sicily, at the southern tip of Italy. After weeks of intense fighting, they advanced into the Italian mainland. The military defeat caused a massive political crisis in Italy. The Italian people, exhausted by the war, the fascists, and hunger, began to revolt. On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini, the man who had once dominated Europe, was arrested by the King of Italy. A month later, Italy surrendered to the Allies. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. And in just a few years, Germany went from being a country forbidden to rearm, to becoming a military powerhouse at breakneck speed. Armament factories sprang up. Conscription was reinstated. The swastika flag flew everywhere. Hitler didn't just want to restore Germany's honor. He wanted to unite all German-speaking peoples, expand the territory to the east, and build a new empire, a Third Reich, that would last forever. Meanwhile, in Asia, another rising power was quietly expanding its empire, Japan. Taking advantage of the civil war in China, Japan began occupying vast territories. They didn't just use modern weapons, but also experimented with chemical and biological warfare, committing horrific atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre. Now, the world had three growing points of tension: Germany at the heart of Europe, Italy to the south, dreaming of restoring Rome, Japan in the east, advancing across Asia. These three powers would soon form an alliance, known as the Axis powers. Wars often begin with the sounds of gunfire, but sometimes, they begin with treaties, political mistakes, and wounds of humiliation that never heal. By now, World War II had not yet begun, but the fire had already been kindled. In the next section, we'll trace the first steps of the war from Austria and Czechoslovakia to Poland, the Spanish Civil War, and the terrifying Blitzkrieg campaign. Part 2, The First Steps of War. In 1938, the heart of Europe began to tremble. Without tanks or gunfire, Adolf Hitler executed the first annexation in his journey to build the new German Empire, Austria. The Austrians spoke German. The Nazi Party had been operating underground in Austria for many years. When Hitler ordered the invasion, the Austrian army didn't resist. In many cities, the people even waved flags and scattered flowers to welcome their brothers from the north. Within just a few days, Austria was fully incorporated into Germany. This event was called the Anschluss, the unification. Europe watched, but did nothing. And that was the first mistake. Soon after, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, home to a large German-speaking population. He declared, "I don't want war. I only want to protect the Germans." Britain and France, having just endured the First World War, feared another conflict. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler, and after several rounds of negotiations, a treaty was signed. Germany was allowed to occupy the Sudetenland in exchange for maintaining peace. Chamberlain returned to London, holding up the treaty and declaring, "We have peace for our time." But he was wrong. That wasn't peace. It was appeasement in the face of an aggressor. A few months later, Hitler swallowed up the rest of Czechoslovakia. Slovakia, to the east, became a German puppet state. By this point, no one doubted Hitler's expansionist ambitions. Britain and France realized, if they didn't act, Poland would be the next victim. Indeed, Hitler had his sights set on the Danzig corridor, which had once belonged to Germany, but was given to Poland after World War I. It was the path to the Baltic Sea, and the land Hitler was determined to reclaim at any cost. But there was a major obstacle. If Germany attacked Poland, it risked being caught between two fronts, the west with Britain and France, and the east with the Soviet Union. And so, the unthinkable happened. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. 1. Operation Barbarossa, breaking the evil alliance. On the morning of June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the eastern border, pouring into the Soviet Union. No declaration of war. No warning. A well-prepared invasion named Barbarossa, named after the Crusader emperor. This was the largest military campaign in human history. 3 million soldiers. 600,000 motor vehicles. 4,000 aircraft. Spanning a front longer than 2,900 kilometers. Hitler believed that only 8 weeks were needed to crush the Soviet Union. He thought the Red Army was weak, the Russians were frail, and that Stalin would collapse into chaos. It was a deadly miscalculation. In the first few weeks, the Germans advanced rapidly. Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk fell. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured or destroyed. German tanks saw the lights of Moscow on the horizon. But there were two things Hitler did not anticipate: the Winter War and the Russian will to fight. Stalin, the tyrant feared by many, suddenly became the leader of the resistance. He ordered, not one step back, burning everything in retreat following the scorched earth policy. The Soviet people, who had once resented Stalin, now fought for their homeland, their families, and their national pride. Then winter came. The Germans, who had prepared for a summer campaign, had no warm clothes, no fuel, and no supplies. Tanks froze in the snow and mud. Soldiers died from the cold more than from bullets. The German army was stopped at the gates of Moscow. And for the first time, the world realized, Nazi Germany was not invincible. 2. A punch from the Pacific. Japan joins the war. In 1941, another threat simmered in the east. In Asia, Japan had been invading China since 1937, committing horrific atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, where over 300,000 civilians were killed, women were raped en masse, and the city was set ablaze. Japan saw itself as the celestial empire, bringing the light of civilization to Asia, but this light was fueled by blood and fire. They formed a bloc called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, but in reality, it was a new form of colonial empire, oppressing native people, forcing labor, and plundering resources. Millions of Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, Indonesians, Vietnamese, and others were enslaved, forced into labor, or used as sex slaves for Japanese soldiers known as comfort women. The United States, concerned by Japan's aggressive actions, imposed an oil embargo, further enraging Japan. Then, Japan decided to strike at the one country they saw as their primary obstacle: the United States. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. A peaceful Sunday morning in Hawaii. The tide was calm. American soldiers were having breakfast, listening to the radio, writing letters to loved ones. Suddenly, the sky was torn apart. Japanese planes, carrying bombs and torpedoes, flew straight into Pearl Harbor, America's largest naval base in the Pacific. 8 battleships were sunk or severely damaged. 300 planes were destroyed. Nearly 2,400 Americans lost their lives. In just 2 hours, Japan delivered a staggering blow to the United States. But they also awakened a sleeping giant. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared before Congress. December 7, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. And the United States formally declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy also declared war on the US. World War II had now truly become global. Hitler was furious. He ordered German troops to occupy northern Italy and rescue Mussolini, establishing a puppet fascist government in the north. Italy was now split. The south was under Allied control. The north was under German occupation. The war continued, but for the first time, an Axis nation had been defeated from within. From the end of 1942 through 1943, 3 key victories, Stalingrad, El Alamein, and Midway, became pillars of hope. In Europe, Germany was stopped in the east and began losing its initiative. In North Africa, the Allies began their counteroffensive. In the Pacific, the US regained control of the seas. History had turned a page. But the war was far from over. Every victory came at the cost of immense loss of life. From 1944 onward, the Allies would open new fronts, pressing the Axis powers from all directions. From France, from Italy, from the Soviet Union, from the seas, and from the skies. And amidst these counterattacks were the bloodiest battles yet: Normandy, Monte Cassino, Kursk, Saipan. These names would be etched into history, not only as victories, but as warnings to humanity. Part 6, the Neuse Titans. Normandy, Kursk, vengeance bombs, and the race to Berlin. 1943 to 1945. The Eastern Front. Operation Overlord. V-bombs. And the fall of the Nazi Empire. By 1944, the world had changed. War was no longer a one-sided conquest by the Axis. It had become a full-scale encirclement. Every inch of land. Every drop of blood. Everything was now a wager between life and death. Kursk. The largest tank battle in history. After the disaster at Stalingrad, Germany didn't give up on crushing the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1943, they launched one last massive offensive. It was called Operation Citadel. Their target was the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines that seemed vulnerable. Hitler believed a swift strike here would destroy the Red Army's main forces and turn the tide. But what he didn't know was that the Soviets had seen it coming. Thanks to brilliant intelligence work, they had pinpointed the attack in advance. They built layer after layer of defenses, over 300 kilometers deep. Millions of landmines. Thousands of trenches. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and tanks. On July 5, 1943, the Battle of Kursk began. Within days, 6,000 tanks were engaged. At Prokhorovka, the two sides smashed into each other in a brutal armored collision. It became the largest tank battle in human history. Germany was bled dry. The Red Army counterattacked. They pushed the Nazis back, reclaiming central Russia. From that point forward, Germany never launched another major offensive in the east. The war had shifted. It was now a retreat, a slow and inevitable collapse of the Nazi war machine. 2. Vengeance from the skies. The air war unleashed. As the front lines on land turned into grinding bloodbaths, another kind of war was reshaping the conflict. A war from the skies. Starting in 1943, Allied forces, especially the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces, launched massive bombing campaigns against Nazi industrial cities like Hamburg, Essen, and Dresden. The goal wasn't just the destruction of war material. It was psychological. To break the will of the people. To paralyze the Nazi war economy. In July 1943, Operation Gomorrah struck Hamburg. Thousands of tons of bombs ignited a firestorm, a hurricane of flame and heat. Over 40,000 civilians were killed in just a few nights. In February 1945, Dresden, a historic city with little military value, was reduced to ashes. Over 25,000 civilians died. The morality of the bombing remains debated to this day. But the Nazis responded. They unleashed their terror weapons, V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets, fired from afar to strike at London. It was the first time in history that cities were bombed by long-range rockets. Thousands of British civilians died. The age of high-tech, long-distance warfare had begun. 3. Normandy. The gateway back to Europe. June 6, 1944. The world turned a page. It was D-Day. After 2 years of planning, millions of Allied troops, under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, launched Operation Overlord. The largest amphibious invasion in history. They hit the beaches of Normandy, northern France. Over 150,000 soldiers from the US, Britain, and Canada stormed ashore on the first day. Nearly 5,000 ships. 11,000 aircraft. They landed on 5 main beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Facing them was Germany's Atlantic Wall, a fortress of bunkers, machine guns, and traps. At Omaha Beach, American troops ran across hundreds of yards of open sand, under withering fire. Thousands were killed in the first few hours. But they didn't retreat. D-Day was more than a military victory. It was the beginning of Europe's liberation. The return of freedom to a continent that had known only occupation and fear. In just 3 months, northern France was freed. Paris was reclaimed. Germany was in full retreat. 4. The race to Berlin. The end draws near. By late 1944, Germany was being squeezed from both sides. The Allies closed in from the west. The Soviets surged from the east. And both sides knew. Whoever reached Berlin first would shape the post-war world. From the east, the Red Army stormed through Poland, Romania, and Hungary. From the west, US, British, and French forces crossed the Rhine, liberating Belgium and the Netherlands. In December 1944, Hitler threw one last desperate punch. The Battle of the Bulge, through the Ardennes. Snow, fog, surprise, but not enough. The Allies held the line. By April 1945, Soviet forces had reached the outskirts of Berlin. On April 16, the final battle began. The Battle of Berlin. Inside the city, old men, teenagers, and terrified civilians were handed rifles and sent to fight. Every building, every alley, became a death trap. 3. The Days of Fire. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. August 6, 1945. A single B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima and dropped the first bomb, codenamed Little Boy. It contained 64 kilograms of uranium-235 and exploded with the force of approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. In an instant, 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a blinding flash. And for those who survived, the agony continued. Burns, radiation sickness, and the trauma of witnessing hell on Earth. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb, Fat Man, powered by plutonium-239, was dropped on Nagasaki. Though smaller in population, the blast killed an estimated 40,000 people instantly. Thousands more died in the days and years that followed from radiation exposure. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military targets. They were cities, filled with civilians, families, children. And the memory of those 2 days would haunt Japan, and the world, forever. 4. Japan surrenders. The end of the war. The horror of Hiroshima might not have been enough. But Nagasaki broke the silence. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made a rare radio address to the Japanese people. For the first time, his voice was heard by the public. He acknowledged that Japan would surrender unconditionally. He said, to continue the war would result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation. Therefore, we must endure the unendurable and accept the unacceptable. On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. World War II, after 6 years of unimaginable suffering, was over. 5. A New World Order. The birth of peace and the Cold War. With Japan's surrender, the Second World War came to a close. But the peace that followed was fragile and complex. The United States, armed with nuclear weapons and an unmatched economy, emerged as a global superpower. It launched the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and became the driving force behind rebuilding Europe and securing the post-war world. But the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, had its own ambitions. It seized control of Eastern Europe and began spreading communist ideology across Asia and beyond. The war had ended, but a new conflict was just beginning. A Cold War. A war of ideologies, of influence, of nuclear brinkmanship. It wasn't fought on battlefields, but in boardrooms, back channels, and proxy wars across the globe. And it would last for decades. Conclusion. World War II was a turning point in human history. A war that killed over 70 million people. A war that reshaped borders, toppled empires, and forced humanity to confront its darkest nature. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were more than just military actions. They were moral earthquakes. They marked the dawn of the nuclear age, and served as a chilling reminder of what humanity is capable of when pushed to the edge. But from the ashes of war rose a new world. One that hoped for peace. One that sought progress. One that stood on the edge of promise and peril. And so, as we close the chapter on this global conflict, we must never forget the price of war, the cost of pride, and the fragile beauty of peace. Because in the end, that's what we fight for. Not conquest. Not revenge. But peace. Real, lasting peace. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Second World War. We hope you'll stay with us as we continue exploring the moments, the decisions, and the people who shaped our history. Remember, peace is the most precious gift we can protect. See you next time. 5. Judgment Day. The Fall of a Tyrant. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in a bunker beneath Berlin. Beside him was his mistress-turned-wife, Eva Braun. 8 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Between 1939 and 1945, just 6 years, the world had witnessed over 60 million deaths. Entire cities wiped off the map. Genocide, starvation, mass deportations. But also, moments of extraordinary courage. Human resilience in the face of absolute darkness. The noose had tightened. The Reich had fallen. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. Far to the east, Japan still held out. The islands of the Pacific still burned. And one terrible decision, one unimaginable act, would soon bring the world to a standstill. That is the story of our final chapter. Part 7. Japan refuses to surrender, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the price of peace. By 1945, the war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had fallen. But in Asia, the war was far from finished. Japan, though battered and cornered, refused to surrender. Its army was in retreat, its navy was shattered in battles like Midway and Leyte Gulf, but its government stood defiant. And so, the Allies prepared for what they believed would be the final blow. A decisive strike that would end the Pacific War once and for all. In this moment of desperation and deadlock, decisions were made. Terrible, irreversible decisions that would change the face of the world forever. 1. Japan's resolve and unyielding spirit. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan had plunged headfirst into its vision of an Asian empire. The leadership believed it was their destiny to dominate the Pacific. And even as the tide of war turned against them, they refused to yield. This stubborn resistance was evident in some of the most brutal battles of the war. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the blood-soaked island-hopping campaigns. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Surrender was shameful. Their enemies were seen as obstacles to be annihilated. Even more chilling were the kamikaze attacks. Japanese pilots, willing to die, hurled themselves and their planes into American warships in suicide missions meant to delay the inevitable. These desperate acts made one thing clear to the Americans. Invading Japan would be a nightmare. It would cost hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, of lives. 2. America's decision. The atomic bomb. By mid-1945, the war in the Pacific had dragged on too long, draining lives and resources. General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz warned of the catastrophic cost of a full-scale invasion of Japan. The country's mountainous terrain, its armed civilians, and its fanatical defense made victory seem possible, but at a terrible price. Faced with this grim reality, and eager to bring the war to a swift end, the United States, under President Harry S. Truman, made a choice that would define the century. They would use a weapon never before seen in warfare. It was called the Manhattan Project. A secret initiative to create the deadliest weapon known to man. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was tested. The explosion lit up the sky and opened the gates to a new era of destruction. Soon after, 2 atomic bombs were prepared. One for Hiroshima and one for Nagasaki.